Over 25 years ago, the Cold War ended and the world changed, but NATO's tactics did not. We see the Enhanced Forward Presence as an extension of former policies and something that only harms the post-war tensions that already exist in the region. Today we will be offering three main points. First, the EFP worsens the security situation. Second, that this is bad for the countries which are accepting these troops in the first place. And my second speaker will be offering the point that this reduces cooperation internationally. But before we go into that, I'd like to talk about some definitions. We define NATO as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a military alliance comprised of 29 member countries with the aim of providing mutual defense. We define the Enhanced Forward Presence, or EFP as we will be referring to it, as a military strategy adopted after the Warsaw Summit on the 9th of July 2016 that places multinational battalions in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania and Poland with the specific mission to deter Russian action. So first, how does this worsen the security situation? The EFP by itself does not stop Russia. It increases the number of troops protecting borders, but this doesn't make a difference for two reasons. One, Russia has an insurmountable geographic advantage that allows it to maintain the upper hand where it strikes first, like the staging point and missiles in Kaliningrad. This is a Russian enclave on the western borders of Poland and Lithuania, and these were moved there in 2016 as a direct response to the EFP, with the Kremlin saying our response will be total and our response will be asymmetric. Secondly, the EFP troop levels are far too low to be effective, only numbering 1,000 per country, relatively. There are no armoured divisions, and to even defeat current Russian border troops, we'd have to spend $3 billion more to scale up that force, which is a crazy amount. The only way that this would help is if NATO follows up, and this won't change with EFP. It depends on the political viability of fighting Russia. Crucially, the EFP does nothing to change the political situation and influence that response. If going to war is difficult for NATO forces, the death of soldiers will be used to justify bringing the boys back home rather than fighting on foreign soil. On the other hand, if going to war is fine, nations can spin these casualties for a reason to go to war. Either way, the EFP changes nothing. Instead, the EFP gives Russia a target to test NATO resolve. Modern Russian military aggression looks vastly different from before. Russia now sends ununiformed militias. It stirs up ethnic tensions to build instability, and this is termed hybrid warfare. When the targeted country responds with military action, Russia then has an excuse to perform large-scale invasion because A, Russia will claim the unarmed militias were just innocent people and portray Western forces as attacking innocent Russian-speaking civilians, and B, this makes it seem like Russia is protecting its people. We have examples of this, like the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, when separatists from South Ossetia attacked Georgian villages. When Georgia responded to defend them, Russia then launched a full-scale invasion and then occupied the separatist areas. When EFP and NATO has declared its intentions in the Baltics, Russia has an incentive to test their resolve. It wins either way that NATO responds. Either NATO puts up a weak response, withdraws forces, does nothing, in which case this is great for Russia. It undermines the credibility of NATO forces, which will not trust NATO as they look weak. Hence, the population will be more inclined to believe that aligning with Russia is in their self-interest. Or NATO puts up a strong response, attempts to fight back with military might, in which case it looks like it's targeting civilians. And this fills the lives of citizens on the ground with fear. This again gives Russia the pretext to intervene. The precedent is the pattern of behaviour in Kashmir, where Pakistan, I'll take in a second, sends ununiformed forces in, and then when India responds, they use this as a pretext to stage an attack. This will happen here as well, yes?
Does your side believe that the Eastern European states have an absolute right to self-defense?
Our side does believe that. However, we don't believe that inciting tensions with specifically NATO forces and this specific policy will actually improve the world situation. Now, why does EFP make this much worse? As mentioned, the EFP was an explicitly NATO campaign to combat Russia, which meant Russian-speaking territories it occupies a prime target for Putin and NATO to resolve. More importantly, NATO would appear more legitimate if it was seen responding to instability after it occurred, rather than being seen as part of the problem as it currently does. And this is an example in Kuwait when the intervening coalition had legitimacy because it was seen as saving a small state from Iraqi aggression. Hence, EFP makes the sort of Russian aggression more likely. Russia will test NATO's resolve and public commitment, and either way NATO chooses to respond, it will come off looking worse for it. Now, this is also bad for countries who are accepting these NATO troops. This is my second substantive. Why EFP makes this uniquely worse is because it antagonizes Russia. Russia is an incredibly insecure country. Putin's legitimacy is not based on a democratic mandate as such, but on maintaining a cult of personality around him. This means projecting an image of strength. That he's the only one strong enough to stand up for Russian-speaking peoples, and that he's the only one strong enough to stand up to Western imperialism. EFP is therefore seen as a direct threat to Russia for a few reasons. One, the EFP was announced as anti-Russia. The Warsaw Summit made it clear that this was a direct response to Russian aggression. Two, the EFP put significant numbers of troops near the Russian border sphere of influence. And three, the EFP constitutes actual combat-ready boots on the ground. Of course, NATO was in these countries before, but these were mostly advisory roles and not combat battalions. Russia must respond to EFP to portray itself as being in a position of strength. If Putin seeks to expand Russia's sphere of influence and once more contain Russian-speaking peoples. Why does it do this? Russia's endgame is convincing people that they need pro-Russian governments and are unwilling to fight the interests of the Russian state. This bolsters Russia's position. Even if they aren't going to be the largest parties in these countries, their political influence will be significant in forming coalitions and for lobbying causes that benefit ethnic Russians. How can they do it? Russia can cut trade. These nations have significant trading ties with Russia. When Poland accepted EFT forces in 2016, Russia cut off trade links for a few months that cost the Polish economy €1 billion. Two, Russia can deny resources. It has a large monopoly on gas pipelines into Europe. This means it cuts off supply to European nations that antagonize it, which happened in Ukraine, and it could do so in Poland as well, which has a massive pipeline running through it. Three, Russia can stir up discontent in these countries through tried and tested Russian methods, such as funding opposition groups and cybercrime. They try to pit the Russian-speaking communities against the broader majority. This has three impacts. One, it undermines centrist governments because they fail to provide for their people. Two, it suggests to citizens of Russia that self-interest align with their own. And three, it makes NATO seem like a useless or harmful organisation that cannot protect them from Russian intervention. This means that these countries are subject to more instability, particularly in the form of ethnic tensions, conflicts, and the appearance that these governments are doing nothing to help them. This means anti-European, pro-Russian parties become more prominent. The sight of NATO forces in Russian-speaking areas furthers the perception that they are being targeted. They therefore flock to parties like the Estonian Centre Party, which is currently in government right now after 2016 and which has ties to United Russia, Putin's own party. In the worst cases, this provides a pretext for annexations and interventions on behalf of Russian-speaking minorities. When Ukraine experienced political turmoil after the Euromaidan protests, Russia used this instability as an excuse to annex Crimea and its Russian-speaking population. If Team South Korea cares about avoiding Russian aggression, their policy creates the very conditions that enable this aggression in the future. If we truly stand for creating a less divided Europe, and if we truly stand for getting rid of instability in the region, then we cannot continue this policy. We beg you to propose.
Previous speakers spent 8 minutes. I thank the first proposition speaker for this. And now to open the case for the opposition, please welcome Ms.
Chair, in April 2015, the President of Estonia begged his NATO allies to send more troops to defend his nation against the Russian military. Recognize that the Baltic states have asked for this policy. Recognize that this is simply a response to all of past Russia's provocations and threatening rhetoric. We don't think the Baltic states' right to defense is contingent on what Putin thinks. We think rather, through the EFP, NATO is getting a huge benefit through a fairly small contribution because we think it's much easier to rely on a physical presence rather than a rhetoric or a document like Article 5 from decades past, we are more than proud to oppose. Let's first look at the context in which we're debating, right? We see Russia as a state that has steadily defined itself in opposition with Western allies and all the values for which it stands. We would characterize Putin as opportunistically warlike. That is, he likes attacking when he knows there isn't going to be much pushback. We give you the examples of Ukraine and Georgia, who aren't NATO nations. He's looking for cases where he can peel off states for Russian influence, but when he knows there is a significant threat, he backs away. The problem with this is that right now, NATO's position has been called into question in a way that it hasn't been since the end of the Cold War. The annexation of Crimea has left open accusations of weakness, and with the election of Trump, there is now a US president that is openly querying the very need for NATO and the collective defense of the West, right? Under this notion, we have three arguments. First, we're going to talk about the necessity and deterrence. Second, we're going to talk about how this accounts for a more effective alliance. And lastly, Nick is going to come here and talk about the destabilization of the Baltic states, but before that, some rebuttals. We first want to make the clarification that borders are meant to be defended, right? That is, there are troops on every single border around the world. We don't think it's provocative that there are troops defending borders. We asked them, what if the Estonian government wanted to put 450 Estonian troops on their border? Do you think their right to defense is conditional, right? Where is the line of appeasement? Because in principle, we don't think there's a difference between Canadian troops and Estonian troops, especially given the fact that they're unable to defend themselves as of their own, right? Let's talk about their first argument about how it worsens security. They talk about geographic advantage and how there's too little troops. Here's the problem. They recognize the aggressive threat. They recognize that it is a military threat. So far, their comparative is leaving them completely vulnerable. Their comparative is somehow relying on this combat-ready troops. Okay, the Estonian government themselves said that these combat-ready troops come in a matter of 5 days. Guess what? The Russian government can take over Estonia in a matter of 36 hours. We don't think their comparative is enough, right? Too little troops is a reason to increase the number of troops, not to completely get rid of the policy. But second, they talk about testing NATO and how Russia is constantly testing NATO, right? Yeah, we agree to that completely. We think Russia has been testing NATO constantly for the past decade, whether they will actually come to defend. If they have a reason to believe that Trump isn't going to come to defend these nations, that's when provocations start to happen. Second argument, how it's bad for countries. They talk about trade and how these nationalist parties and how ethnic tension arises. First on trade, we don't think that the threat of Russia cutting off trade ties is a reason to sacrifice security. The fact is, Russia has been making threats of cutting off their oil trades or whatnot for past 30 years. We don't think they have done that so far. We don't think it's going to prioritize security. But we also want to recognize that the Baltic states have asked for this, and we think NATO is what's preventing extremism in these countries. NATO is a nuancing factor between Baltic states and Russia. Let's also talk about why this legitimizes Putin's regime, what they talked about. First of all, we don't think this is an exclusive problem, right? Putin is someone that uses stuff like pro-LGBT groups in his nation to as Western intervention. He's someone that uses anything to justify Western animosity. We think if it's not this, it's going to be something else. He's someone that uses anything as a pretext. But second, we think Putin being able to chip off more Baltic states is something that is an easier gain to his popularity and supremacy. We don't think that comparative is any better. Lastly, let's talk about the tension in their case. They say on one hand that it's too little troops, it's not going to be effective. On the other hand, they say it's such big of a provocation that it's going to make the Russians feel like it's a huge threat. We don't think they can have both on that.
Point of information.
First argument, sure.
Is there nothing provocative about the rhetoric saying that you're going to defend from Russian aggression directly by putting troops on the border?
We don't believe the idea of provocation exists, right? Putin is going to use anything as a provocation. We don't think that is an excuse to sacrifice the security of the Baltic states. You don't have a mechanism in securing the Baltic states. That's why you already lose. First argument on necessity and deterrence. We think the context is that Russian aggression is increasing, where nations like Georgia and Ukraine were violated of all international law without any retribution. On top of that, Baltic states live in fear, and therefore when they see Russian armies close to their border, combined with aggressive political rhetoric, they feel threatened. And we think they have a justifiable reason to feel threatened, because they were once part of the Soviet Union and fought tirelessly to get rid of that influence. Nick will talk more about that. But look, even if we put aside this historical context, the Russian military regularly conducts its exercises near the Baltic borders with up to 80,000 Russian troops. We refuse the notion that EFP is somewhat provocative. Hence, why does this policy deter Russian aggression? We think EFP acts as a deterrent tripwire force, which makes an attack much less likely to begin with. Putting US, British, or Canadian troops on the border massively raises the stakes for Russia for any attack, as now there is guaranteed US intervention. That means if even one US soldier is harmed, US will have all the political incentive to wage full-on war against Russia. They don't have that incentive in them. It's important to note that a deterrent tripwire force doesn't need to be a lot of, thousands of troops to be effective. We gave you the quintessential example of a tripwire force that between North and South Korea, there are just 400 US soldiers. We think that's enough to ensure that the costs of a raid are massively high, even for a rogue state like our northern neighbors. Moreover, we say that despite Article 5, Putin now has a reason to calculate that in the age of Trump, the US might not go to war to save a country like Estonia. We think the presence of NATO soldiers in those countries is what guarantees a response from the West. That acts as a direct statement against aggressors, regardless of what Trump says. Second argument, why this accounts for a more effective alliance. We think this guarantees NATO's cohesion and cements its role as a leader. Because given that Eastern European nations are concerned about the integrity of the Western alliance, it is vital that there is some tangible guarantee that states like the United States will actually come to defend if necessary. No, thank you. We think Putin's aim is to destabilize NATO and the Western alliance. He'd like nothing more than for the alliance against him to fracture, which is why he constantly tests Europe militarily, right? The world-side government is a world where they literally bow down to Putin's pressure and does exactly what he wants, right? Where Baltic states who've lived under Russian dominance within living memory are told that their right to self-defense is a provocation. We think the best way to guarantee the cohesion and strength of the Western alliance is to defend its most easterly outputs, which is why, even in our worst-case scenario that Russia does attack, this is what ensures a win to the war. I'll give you the example of Georgia, that even during the Russian invasion, it was when the United States stepped up their full military initiatives that Russia backed away. We think even in our worst-case scenario, we guarantee a win. 3 reasons. First of all, this presence is what makes it more likely that Russia will wave the white flag earlier on into the conflict, given Putin's character of going after easy wins. Second, we think Baltic states don't have the military capability to defend themselves. That is, US and Canada troops have equipment they do not. We're talking about things like more troops, better weapons, better on-ground intelligence. These are things that makes it a much more winnable conflict. But lastly, given the context of Russia's invasions of plausible deniability that it involves a degree of confusion, we think NATO's troops are much better suited to calculate those strategies. Like in Ukraine, the invasion of little green men who didn't identify to any army makes defense a lot harder, which is why we think NATO troops prevent Russian advancement into Baltic states. We have Western media on our side, we have the international watch on our side. We think that makes deniability a lot more harder. We don't think the defense of the Baltic states is contingent on what Putin thinks. We are very proud to oppose.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes, 26 seconds. 8 minutes, 26 seconds.
I thank the first opposition speaker for this.
Ladies and gentlemen, proposition's burden in today's debate is simple. It's to show you that whatever opposition is suggesting does not bring them any closer to what they want to achieve, but also causes harms in the process. If we do that, we've won today's debate. Right. So let's just, before I go into my substantive, let's just deal with some themes that have come out of their case. First, on this idea about whether our side believes Eastern powers have a right to self-defense, and on all of that, right? Of course we do. Of course we believe they have a right to self-defense. All we need to show you is that the enhanced forward presence itself is not at all an effective way for them to achieve this, right? It seems they missed all of the analysis in our first about why NATO troops are an entirely ineffective way to do this. So let me just remind them. Firstly, on Russia's insurmountable geographic advantage. They need to look at a map and understand that Kaliningrad, right, it's a position. It's a position that Russia reinforced after the enhanced forward presence. The reason they reinforced it was in a response, right? No matter how many troops you put in that area, Russia's position geographically is very strong. So if they try to invade through that, Russia will be able to crush them down. Secondly, on this idea about how, secondly, on this idea of numbers of troops, I don't think they understood how significant this is. Think about how Russia invaded Georgia. They invaded them with 850,000 troops. Unless the 3,200 troops that they're proposing from NATO forces are Avengers of some form, they're not going to be able to deal with this. Regarding the 850,000 troops, they would steamroll them, right? But even if they suggest that their next position, and this was interesting because they said that the Estonian government requires 5 days notice. In order to establish the sort of armored battalions they want on their side, you need 7 days notice of a Russian invasion, which is just, you need 2 days more on their side, right? And moreover, if they do suggest this, they need a $3 billion investment. Opposition needs to tell us where all of this is coming from. Thirdly, what is it that they're actually defending here? Is it the enhanced forward presence, or is it the enhanced forward presence? We're happy to debate them on that, but meet us at lunch if they want to do that, right? So secondly, now that we've dealt with this whole idea about how Eastern powers have a right to self-defense, the important takeaway from this is that they do, but the way they're suggesting it, the enhanced forward presence, is entirely ineffective. Secondly, this idea, and this is the big kind of theme that came out of their case, is on the deterrent to require force, right? How the attack on NATO enhanced forward presence would require an attack from all of NATO's allies. Two responses on this, two layers. Firstly, everything in Rowan's case about the way nations can spin these political narratives was not responded to. This exists on both sides, right? Regardless of the enhanced forward presence, if 50 of these NATO troops are killed, right, these nations are capable of spinning it. What is the important thing they take away by putting troops on the ground? Political discretion of these countries to actually spin the narratives in a particular way. So basically on their side they're saying, NATO troops exist, there will be attacks, the attack will force the hand of all of the allies to respond, even though it could be over something like this land skirmish in Lithuania, right? That's completely unrealistic and completely something we don't stand for. But secondly, on what the massive risk of all of this is. The massive risk of escalation. What is the outcome they're actually looking for? Are they looking for a unified NATO response? What is the risk that they're taking here? They're saying that basically, what does it mean when you have this kind of response? So you're saying a couple of things, right? Firstly, you're talking about commanders on the ground who are in charge of particular military strategic decisions. They can be unreasonable, there's lots of historical precedent to this, they can make mistakes, right? All of that can trigger an escalatory response that could potentially lead to a massive war between the East and the West, right? Are they willing to risk that over small land skirmishes in Lithuania? We don't think this is reasonable in any particular way, and for them to stand for this, they have to do a lot of work, right? And all of that entirely is dealt with. The two major themes that came out of their case have been dealt with now, and now that I've done that, let's move into my substantive. On how the Eastern forward presence means that Russia will refuse to cooperate with Western powers. Why is this true? 3 reasons. First, Putin has an incentive to not cooperate with the West. He fears undercutting his domestic image, which Rowan told you about, if he cooperates with Western states while simultaneously running the rhetoric that these states are engaging in illegitimate behavior. Second, in the status quo, Russia uses Western aggression towards Russia, especially the Eastern forward presence, as a bargaining chip. And third, Western aggression in general, epitomized by the campaign of the EFP, Rowan told you about, antagonizes Russia, which seeks to punish Western countries. All the reasons for Russia's expansionism that came out at first apply here. Why is this a problem? Because many extremely important international issues are contingent on Russia's cooperation. To show you the incalculable harms Russia's lack of cooperation with Western powers has on the international community, a direct result of NATO's Eastern forward presence, 4 key issues. First, in the Middle East. In the massively complex landscape of a war-torn Syria, the only power that can currently reign in Bashar al-Assad is Russia. To broker ceasefires in even single cities we've needed Russia's help. However, Russia has consistently held off on signing peace treaties until the very last moment. Let's take a look at the conditions in which Putin finally agreed to sign these peace treaties. While the US Congress was debating a bill on sanctions, Russia very obviously hinted that it could not sign the treaty while the bill was in the House, only signing it when international pressure became backbreaking. The deals that were signed could have been signed 2 to 3 months earlier before thousands of people died. So what happened here? Under the guise of anger at the, wait for it, Eastern Forward Presence, Russia held up signing the peace treaty to influence the decision of the US Congress on sanctions. Thus, the cost of EFP needs to be evaluated through this lens. In order to keep it in place, we have to incur the cost of thousands of Syrian lives. Second, oil. Russia controls the Druzhba pipeline, the world's largest oil pipeline that runs through the heart of Western Europe. And here we got a bit of the whole thing about trade and how that doesn't apply in Baltic nations, completely missing the fact that in the last 6 months after the Eastern Forward Presence was established, Poland lost $1 billion because Russia was not willing to trade with them, right? That's a very real harm that happened, and they need to show us why that's empirically false, right? But suddenly, everyone from the now that Russia is entirely willing and able to shut off gas, as they have in the past in response to sanctions over Crimea. Suddenly, everyone from the working class to pensioners will have to pay for more gas. Those who can't afford it will quite possibly freeze through winter. The EU economy is weak as it is. If you drive up the prices of a key commodity like gas, what little recovery we see today may well disappear. Third, the Arctic. The melting of Arctic ice and the opening of potential new trade routes means we now need to work out what belongs to whom in the Arctic. Russia at present is abiding by the UNCLOS and the Arctic Council. Surrounding them in Eastern Europe means they'll seek alternative arenas for power. The Arctic trade routes and its natural resources are an obvious choice. Why is this bad? 2 reasons. First, it puts Russia unilaterally in control of lots of world trade. Bad thing, right? Second, intense resource exploitation by Russia there would contribute heavily to global warming instead of just leaving those fuels under the sea. Fourth, cybersecurity frameworks. Unsurprisingly, Russia is a major culprit in cyber attacks. For example, the cyber attacks in Estonia in 2007 that Russia does not directly claim responsibility for, but that many Russian political figures have claimed responsibility for, and that Estonian officials have little doubt were orchestrated by Russia. Russia may well respond to the Eastern Forward Presence with crippling cyber attacks. Crucially, NATO doesn't have a coherent doctrine for how to respond to such attacks, in part because, like in Estonia in 2007, it's almost impossible to empirically prove that they were orchestrated by a state. Even Donald Trump refuses to believe it, right? The Eastern Forward Presence means Russia would refuse to cooperate in the updating of treaties like the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, an international treaty seeking to address internet and computer crime. In fact, while the Eastern Forward Presence is in place, Russia will likely inflict cybercrimes on Baltic nations themselves. The harms on their side are far too great. They don't do anything that doesn't happen on both sides. Therefore, propose. Thank you very much.
Previous speaker spent 8 minutes 12 seconds. 8 minutes 12 seconds.
I thank the second opposition speaker for their speech. And now to the case for the opposition, please welcome Nicholas.
At the point at which Russia has annexed 3 independent nations in the past 2 decades, is massing 100,000 troops on your border, and has deployed tactical nuclear weapons in Kaliningrad in 2016 before the EFP came around, we think, yes, Baltic states have a heck of a right to demand sovereignty and defense. That was the biggest flaw on team proposition today. The biggest problem on government side today is that they have a real stance issue. Either this NATO EFP does nothing like they told you, or it's such a massive threat that makes Putin wake up in a cold sweat every day and forces him to become really scared and aggressive. those two worlds can exist at the same time. In my speech, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to go over the 2 points of contention. Firstly, is the EFP necessary for deterrence? Secondly, does it allow for a more effective alliance? I'm going to go into my third argument and tell you why the Enhanced Forward Presence prevents the destabilization of the Baltic states and Poland, directly clashing with one of their arguments. Firstly, the necessity for deterrence. We gave you a very clear, nuanced case today, which we heard almost no response to. We told you that Baltic states are fearful of Russia's influence today. Absolutely no response on their side of the house. Recognize that over 60% of citizens of the Baltic states view NATO as a protection. Only 8% of citizens of Poland view it as a threat. And in private conversations, Putin has threatened to invade these countries as leverage. To these Baltic states, Mother Russia looks a lot like the big bad wolf, Mr. Speaker. Recognize, secondly, we told you about the deterrence required. So we're not necessarily concerned that it's 450 troops or 500 troops. Recognize that just a small number of NATO troops guarantees intervention, and that doesn't happen on their side. They told you, well, it's possible for nations to spin it. Mr. Speaker, seriously tell me how the U.S. Defense Minister is going to spin the Fox News headline of 50 U.S. Marines killed. I'd like to see you try to spin that on Fox News. No, in fact, that's really impossible. All foreign policy experts know the sensitivity of populations to U.S. casualties, and no U.S. president can ever ignore the death of his servicemen abroad. Every single national leader knows that, and Putin knows that. So their own sons and daughters are murdered, it's impossible to spin that. Then we told you about the comparative. The Baltic states don't trust Trump today. Again, absolutely no response. We're seeing a president who spent his entire presidential campaign calling NATO obsolete and refused to even mention Article 5's collective defense principle, its most bedrock of principles, and he's shown clear incompetence in the factual errors in foreign policy. No nation today is willing to base their national security upon the word of Donald Trump. We don't even trust Donald Trump, necessitating an actual presence. Then, what did we hear on their side of the house? They told you that Russia isn't cooperating with its Western neighbors, that you're undercutting their image, you're making Russia seem like the victim. Recognize, Mr. Speaker, that actually Russian aggression has caused this. Exactly. We're seeing Russia refusing to cooperate, even the West tried to cooperate with them. Recognize that the West tried to hit the reset button with Russia after 9/11, during the Obama administration. There's no interest in Putin doing so because he wants it serves his political agenda to be in constant opposition to the West. So if you get rid of the EFP, how exactly will that change his calculus? In fact, we would contend it's perfectly reasonable that Baltic states feel threatened. Then again, we would add an additional layer of analysis to that and tell you, in fact, there are many things that Putin uses as a pretext for his actions. Michelle already told you this. Even like democratic NGOs in Russia are supposed evidence of Western infiltration in a moment, sir, and it's an excuse for Russia to crack down on democratic institutions with that excuse. Putin is an expert in using his grievances, either real or imagined, against the West to pursue his own agenda. If we took the EFP away, he would simply find another way to pursue his goals. Yes, sir.
Surely you recognise that the impact of troops carrying guns on your border is much more than the impact of westernized NGOs.
I thought in the first half of your speech you said they change nothing. That's a real big leap from change nothing to cause Putin to become really, really, really angry. That was a contradiction you really have to clear up, but at that point I think it's going to be quite late. Then the second speaker comes up and gives us a third argument. Oil pipelines, we're going to lose $1 billion. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, the comparative is, this is the status quo, that Russia is harmed too. Secondly, we think we would rather lose $1 billion in the US, in US dollars, than have like Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania take it over. But we also think that their link was really vague here. They said this will lead to global warming, Russian market hegemony, and cyber attacks. Like, Mr. Speaker, let's seriously think about that. You really think that 450 Canadian troops on the border is going to lead to global warming, Russian oil hegemony, and cyber attacks? Really need to clarify the logic on that. Second point of contention doesn't lead to a more effective alliance. We told you why Georgia and the US and military alliances are a similar parallel. We told you why the nature of warfare has changed. Recognize that Putin's entire career was built off of quick and easy victories that won him support where the opponent was quickly caught off guard and had no ability to quickly react. We've seen this campaign in, for example, South Ossetia. We've seen it in the quick annexation of Crimea, in the invasion of South Ossetia and Chechen separatists. All of these were quick and easy victories portrayed as evidence of Putin's strength. Note that Putin did not go further to annex the capitals of those countries because that would have meant a prolonged military conflict. So Putin actually today only wants a quick media-friendly operation for domestic support. We changed the calculus of Putin on our side of the house. Why do we do that? Because right now he only wants to hit the low-hanging fruit. Countries like Ukraine, countries like or regions like South Ossetia. Now an invasion of NATO troops is guaranteed to be bloody and difficult. We put that fruit a bit further out of reach. Then we told you about hybrid warfare. We think this is especially important and actually is on our side of the house. Russia oftentimes engages in hybrid warfare like it did in Crimea, where specially trained troops without identifying patches moved quickly and suddenly to secure key installations. Long after, for example, the Crimean annexation was underway, the Obama administration demanded withdrawal, at which point the Kremlin raised the stakes by massing 40,000 troops on eastern Ukraine's eastern border. The US couldn't confirm that the invasion was taking place and couldn't react quickly enough. This action can be replicated in the Baltic states. At the point at which Russia has suddenly rolled over several countries, the stakes would be too high to try to take back now Russian territory. It's much easier to defend existing territory than take back land from an entrenched enemy position. Then rebutting their third argument, or their second argument directly with our third argument, where we tell you it leads more to the destabilization of Baltic states. The thesis of this argument is that the Baltic states are prone to destabilization without the visible and explicit assurances of NATO forces. So remember the context that Mitchell brought you, that the Baltic states were a part of Russian territory annexed in the 1940s and gained their independence just 25 years ago. So then, in 2014, Russia annexes Crimea as Spetsnaz forces and directly funds Eastern Ukrainian separatists to plunge the nation into perpetual civil war under the guise of protecting ethnic Russians, ignoring the security assurances in 1994 that Russia, the US, and the UK gave Ukraine in exchange for giving up nuclear weapons. So Baltic states now feel like a similar scenario can directly threaten them. The pretext Russia used in 2014 to protect ethnic Russians can be used in Baltic states as well. But those states now fear that Western countries will break their promises and security assurances like they actually did in Ukraine. Thus, when nations cannot trust security guarantees, they may move into an outright defensive, hostile posture that verges on outright brinkmanship. We already see the beginnings of this trend today, that Lithuania reintroduced conscription in 2015, that you're seeing increasing support for far-right nationalist parties in countries like Turkey that fear the Russian influence, that Ukraine even recently initiated a bill to reintroduce nuclear weapons. So how does the EFP comparatively stop that on our side of the house? We think that NATO helps create better stability with a physical explicit presence. And less NATO protection makes you a lot more vulnerable to aggressively defensive action. So the potential for skirmishes and escalation increases. So a Canadian soldier, Mr. Speaker, along the Russian border can react a lot more calmly when they're not under the psychological pressure that their nation is under attack. Nations are more stable when they are secure, and NATO's EFP increases their security for almost no downside. Mr. Speaker, we stand with the free and sovereign countries of Eastern Europe. Stand with Team Opposition.
The previous speaker spent 8 minutes 14 seconds. 8 minutes 14 seconds.
And then the second opposition speaker for this.
Wow.
And now to continue the case for the proposition, please welcome Moha.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's make this very clear. In July of 2016, the EFP was introduced. In August of 2016, there were nukes in Kaliningrad. This is a direct response from Putin, who said, we are going to pursue total war. You never get that sort of rhetoric in the case where Putin is trying to victimize a random NGO. They need to tell us why these troops that they agree are ineffective at actually stopping any invasion is actually going to meaningfully change anything, but also to avoid all of the harms that we give you about rhetoric and all these things. I think this debate came down to 3 words. Firstly, which side can actually defend the Baltics, or can we defend the Baltics at all? Secondly, which side empowers Putin to do worse things? And thirdly, which side gets more cooperation? So on this first point of clash, which is on can we actually defend the Baltics? So they keep pointing out a tension in our case, which they claim is a tension, right? So they say, on our side, we say that you don't have enough troops to do anything, so the response is to put more troops. They fail to get the nuance in this argument, which is to say, no amount of troops ever helps, right? No, they give you no response to any of the argumentation about Kaliningrad and about how this means that there's an insurmountable geographic advantage. The idea is they can set up a land blockade that means that no troops or anything is ever going to get in, and thus you're never going to be able to win a war in and around these Baltic states. But we tell you specifically that we don't actually think Russia is going to invade these Baltic states. Why do we think this? Because we tell you in many cases, these Baltic states are pretty hard to hold, right? We think like, in like the case of like Poland, for example, we think there's no Russian minority there that they can help hold these states. But also remember the last person to invade Poland needed like a massive mandate, i.e. this was Hitler with Germany, right? Where he had to have a mandate that says we're going to restore sort of a Nazi greatness and create a new like master race, right? Sure. This is something that Russia, as bad as it is, simply hasn't done. But note, ladies and gentlemen, that even if they say that Russia might invade, the benefits, and this is direct response to all of the tripwire stuff, are contingent on getting a NATO response. The criminal thing here is they never tell us why this makes it more likely to get a NATO response. When we tell you about the idea that you can spin things different ways, they tell us, well, how do we spin this? Note, Rowan told you they can spin this in a specific way, which is saying, these people are troops, went abroad and died fighting for foreign soil. Let's bring them home, ladies and gentlemen. That's the way they spin. Sure. But ladies and gentlemen, when they tell you that like people don't trust Trump to trigger Article 5 and that sort of thing, we tell you that if Trump is so disinterested in like international security, they're never proving why exactly Trump is going to intervene, even with dead US soldiers coming back. So we think they fundamentally undermine their own case by giving us this point. But finally, and this is really, really important to underline this, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that even if, on their side, the argument is this removes the discretion within Western countries in terms of engaging Russia. Why is this so bad? Because, ladies and gentlemen, this is a conflict not between Latvia and Russia, Latvia, which is a relatively small state, which has relatively little power. This becomes a fight between the East and the West, two nuclear powers, ladies and gentlemen. What they have to defend on their side is creating an extremely volatile situation that puts two nuclear powers against each other and potentially ends in nuclear holocaust. No, but we think that they're probably going to tell us something to the effect of, well, they're not going to engage in like nuclear warfare. What they need to deal with is the risk of uncertainty, right? That is, commanders in the field hold the buttons. Why? Because when you're Russia, or when you're the US, or NATO, etc., what you don't want is to call up Trump, have him call Steve Bannon, and then say, yeah, let's nuke them back. The second you see something on your radar, nuke or not, whether or not you're 100% sure or 20% sure, you strike back. Because if you don't strike back, your entire facilities are destroyed. You've already lost. All it takes on their side is a miscalculation, ladies and gentlemen. This leads me directly into our next point, which is if we're forced to sort of support an alternative and sort of guarantee their sort of border security, etc., what do we think should happen? We think probably it shouldn't be NATO troops, it should be Latvian troops. We think to the extent that every border in the world, as they characterize it, has troops on it, which we don't think is necessarily true, we think they normally have troops of their own country and don't ask the entire Western sort of alliance to say, come give us your troops. So we don't think fundamentally that actually makes a difference. I'll take you next.
So you say that Putin uses the EFP as an excuse to ramp up anti-Western rhetoric. He also uses the presence of pro-democracy NGOs in Russia and support for LGBT rights to excuse a certain crackdowns on democratic institutions. Should we stop those efforts as well?
Okay, so firstly, we told you why this is specifically worse in that he can say, here's Western imperialism in these places, here's Western imperialists attacking Russian-speaking people, and this means that we can send nukes. The difference on their side and the comparative is this. On their side, they maybe send some troops to the Russian border. Maybe they've got a few tanks. On their side with the EFP, they have nukes in Kaliningrad. Defend that, ladies and gentlemen. So we think fundamentally this gets us onto our second point of substantive, which is on which side really empowers Russian war. So they tell us on their side, no thank you, which is that Putin sort of engages in sort of free wins, that he's sort of super opportunistic, and this is how he does things. And fundamentally what they need to prove to us here is that the EFP makes it less likely to get free wins. The criminal thing here is that they don't tell us why these, they don't deal with the analysis as to why we tell you they get more free wins on our side. That is, we told you it changes the narrative, right? So from being Putin is using a relatively, like really flimsy subtext, like an NGO, to go in and sort of attack other countries, it goes to these, Putin is responding to the EFP and NATO coming in first. The first mover in this case is NATO. That means Putin's legitimacy is increased. That means he gets a free win. On our side, he doesn't get a free win because people say he came in first. We think fundamentally this changes it. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we didn't they failed to understand sort of why it's different for Latvia to sort of ramp up versus for NATO to ramp up. Because we tell you, just take an example of Nepal, right? So Nepal is near to India and Pakistan, right? If Nepal sends all of its military might, gets every single man on the ground, calls conscription every able-bodied man, what happens is Narendra Modi laughs to his mates and says, "Lol, this is never going to do it," right? But what happens if Pakistan puts all of its military might there? Is Narendra Modi gets really scared and says, "Put all of our troops there as well." I think fundamentally they need to deal with the difference between these two things. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, they failed to tell us why. And given that we've proven to you that this makes no real difference in terms of security, they failed to prove to us, no thank you, why we should accept the harms on their side of having these troops in the first place. We gave you 4. We told you it increases ethnic tensions, and these sorts of troops themselves become a flag bearer to attack. Note the EFP is not just troops, it is a position as well. It says, we're planting the NATO standard, we're planting the West on your border. That's a standard that Russian-speaking minorities and separatists and etc. can attack and actively act against, leading to more ethnic tension. But 2, we told you it changes narratives and makes Russia appear to be the innocent party, giving legitimacy and free wins. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, we told you to undermine centrist governments in terms of showing that NATO is weak when Russia eventually pulls. They need to tell us why having a weak force doesn't get these harms, but also doesn't lead to any of the massive problems with the tripwire force in the first place. Finally, on whether or not we get cooperation. We told you they sort of assert here that TAR's material has no logical link. We gave you a specific logical link as to how these sorts of, the EFP is used as a negotiating chip that leads to Russia not cooperating on so many vital issues. Unless they can prove to us that this is not going to be used in some way, that Russia is not going to spin this in any way, they have to accept all of the harms that TAR gives you. Of millions of Syrians dying before we sign a proper deal. We beg you to propose.
Previous speakers spent 8 minutes, 20 seconds. 8 minutes, 20 seconds.
I can approach the opposition speaker for your And now to continue the case for the opposition. Yes. And now to continue the case for the opposition, please welcome Ye.
Government told us that they are not willing to sacrifice the security of Eastern European nations. So far in this debate, I haven't heard an explanation from team government as to how they make sure that these nations are more secure. That's what this debate should ultimately boil down to. Two questions in this debate. Number one, what happens actually on the border? And number two, what happens to NATO nations? So firstly, what happens on the border? Their characterization of Russia is quite interesting. Note that their prime minister said that Russia wants to test NATO. We think this is something that is going to happen regardless of whether you have soldiers on the border or not. You have to recognize that Putin is always looking out for easy wins, easy victories. That is the stance that we give you consistently on opposition. If that is the case, and if he is running out of non-NATO nations on the map, if he feels like NATO nations aren't being as secure and protected as before, we think that is a reason for him to test NATO. We think now is more dangerous than ever, and we think that we change Putin's calculus. Because now, when Putin attacks Latvia or Lithuania or those countries, we think that he can surely expect pushback from NATO nations, the American government, the British government, whichever NATO nation it may be. We think that that suddenly ruins his image as an easy win getter that he can portray to the Russian media, that he can portray to the Russian population. At the point that it is very hard to take over land in those countries, we think we change Putin's calculus. That is the characterization of Putin that their side has never engaged with in this debate. But then again, the government whip suddenly changes their stance and says Russia is not a threat. We think even if it was not a threat, there is a reason that Eastern European nations as of now feel that it is a threat. The fact that there is training along the border, the fact that they can see soldiers across the border. We think that these Eastern European states, as much as they try their best to protect their citizens, they have admitted themselves that they can't. And we are the side that providing an alternative for them. We are the side that says yes to their demands. You have every right to protection. You have every right to sovereignty. They have not engaged with our principles. But we also told you about the deterrent requirement. Their response coming from government whip is, oh, you have to guarantee NATO response. Okay, two things. We think we're better on a comparative for two reasons. First of all, we think that we increase the chance that NATO actually cares. Because if 50 Lithuanian soldiers die on the border, we would like to imagine that NATO is going to care, but if there is a slight chance that they will not, that gives a reason and a pretext for Putin to attack. Secondly, we think we guarantee a more immediate response. Why is that the case? Because we think that at the point that 450 Canadian soldiers are already on the border, NATO has already committed itself that they will defend these borders no matter what happens, and we think we guarantee that quicker response. They need to be comparative in this debate, because so far I haven't heard what kind of stance they want NATO to take. I haven't heard how NATO will respond in their case scenario under which Russia attacks. But secondly, they have given little to no response to the deterrent tripwire effect. We tell you that the comparative is not a peaceful border. We first of all change the incentives of soldiers on both sides. Because if they recognize that at the point that they accidentally have a shooting that can lead to war, chances are they're going to be much more careful, they're going to be much more calm. But secondly, we think that the comparative of Lithuanian and Latvian soldiers that they've brought up is worse. Because oftentimes these are soldiers that feel fear, anger towards Russia because of the fact that they fear that Russia is attacking their homeland. It is in those very instances that they can miscalculate and accidentally have a shooting on the border because they saw that Russian soldier walking toward them and thought it was an attack. We think we provide a better comparative in which we guarantee a better security and a calmer security. Yes?
If a Lithuanian soldier or Latvian soldier shoots a Russian soldier, he doesn't commit the entirety of NATO to war, possibly nuclear war, with Russia. Tell us how you get that with the EFP.
Okay, so is their side saying that NATO should intervene in the instances in which these soldiers die or not? We still haven't heard an answer from their side regarding that. But secondly, we think that that shooting is much less likely to happen on our side for all the reasons that I've already explained. Finally, thirdly, we talked about security. They gave us the response that the alternative is Latvian soldiers. We've already explained why that's worse. But then they said, oh, these number of soldiers aren't enough because the Russian military is so strong. This is inconsistent with their stance, but we've already responded responded to that, Mr. Madam Speaker. We have told you that you don't need a lot of soldiers for it to be a deterrent tripwire. We give you the example of North Korea and South Korea. As much as Kim Jong-un is crazy, that doesn't mean that he is walking across the border and shooting at American soldiers on the border. They don't explain why Putin's calculus would be any different from that. But we are the side that dealt with the worst case scenario. Even in the instance in which a conflict were to occur, we gave you all the benefits. Michelle told you, Nick told you in their arguments why we get those benefits. But I'm going to add to that by talking about two benefits on the comparative. First of all, we think that communication and decision making is much easier because NATO now recognizes that they have already committed themselves to defense. Secondly, we think that it's easier to defend a particular territory than to take back a territory that has already been lost. Because we have to recognize that when you talk about Putin like taking bits of land, in the instance in which that happens and Lithuanian and Latvian soldiers cannot respond to that, we have to start the war or start like the battle by taking back that land. We don't have that response because we can push back from the beginning and say you cannot take this land. Second flash in this debate, what happens to NATO nations? Their Deputy Prime Minister says that, oh, it's going to be used to legitimize Putin's regime and we can't get Russian cooperation. Their burden isn't simply to prove that that's going to happen. Their burden is to prove that that's an exclusive part of the NATO Enhanced Forward Presence. We gave you the analysis that Putin's agenda is always going to be anti-West because that is how he feeds his popularity, that is how he garners his support. And that means that regardless of whether we have troops on the border or not, chances are Putin is going to support anti-Western agenda. We have not heard a response so far. But finally, let's talk about the idea of Eastern European nations. They gave us several harms. They told you, oh, they have economic harms. Oh, we have Russian minorities there, so we have harms. Again, their burden isn't to simply bring this up. Their burden is to talk us through the exclusivity of these harms. We think that the danger or the threat of Putin cutting off economic benefits is something that is going to exist on both sides of the status quo. We think that Putin trying to approach the Russian minority and try to have very pro-Russian propaganda on the Russian minority is something that is going to happen on both sides in the status quo. What they have to prove, though, is that this is something that is more harmful. We don't think this is the case because we think that these are democratic nations that can choose what is more important than another. And at the point that their Prime Minister has asked for security, we think that the choice of Estonians, we think that the choice of Lithuanians, the choice of Latvians has been more security. Yes, we may suffer some economic consequences, but we want security better, and that is the choice that they have made. And we think that it is right for NATO to respond to them in light of the fact that NATO has always been a consistent alliance that tries to protect the democratic nations on the West. Therefore, we are the side that guarantees a consistent NATO stance and furthermore decreases the likelihood of Russian threat. Therefore, rather than the side without any comparatives, vote for opposition.
The previous speakers had 8 minutes, 9 seconds. 8 minutes, 9 seconds.
I can third opposition speaker for your speech.
It'll come back.
We now move to the team's 4 minutes concluding reply speeches. To deliver the opposition's reply speech, please welcome Nicole.
Guys ready? There are 2 reasons that Team UAE loses today. First, they failed to deal with a comparative in which NATO states ignore Baltic states' request for more troops and just pull out. Secondly, they failed to deal with the deeper nuances of our case. 2 ways. One question we have to ask ourselves is which side makes it more likely that conflict occurs? None of us want a war to occur. Even if we want a war to occur, we want it to be done as fast as possible. What did we hear on their side of the house? They told you that Putin uses this as an excuse to get really, really angry. We've given you a clear, nuanced rebuttal on why we tell you oftentimes dictators and people in positions of power without democratic institutions use anything and anything to use it as a grievance to go get angry at the West. We give you our example of the crazy neighbor to the north from Kim Jong-un. Just because we pulled out US troops out of South Korea would not mean that he would be a happy camper and want to reunify. In fact, he uses everything. Heck, he even uses K-pop broadcasts over the radio stations to say that we need to invade South Korea. No, that was not engaged with. Secondly, we told you, it is harder for Russia to go to war. They told you, guys, why do we even try? Russia is so big. If he wants to destroy us, then he will destroy us. It's very nihilistic, right? No, Mr. Speaker, why do we even have armies in the first place? We told you very clearly why that wasn't the case. That even if Russia now wants to take over the Baltic states, he will have to deal with the consequences of 20,000 Russian body bags. That now, the perception in the Russian media is no longer Putin is half naked on a horse and has massive military victory. It is 20,000 Russians dead. That is a comparative they failed to engage with. But also, let's think about the two scenarios in which Russian attacks occur. Either it's the hybrid warfare that Putin has mastered over the couple of years. Hybrid warfare, ethnic tensions, increasing that. It is much easier to prevent those when you actually have NATO troops on the ground, able to quell down those conflicts that Russia seeks to inflame. That is a comparative that you didn't deal with. But furthermore, in the case of full-scale war, we told you about the deterrent required. The only little response they told you on the other side of the house was that you can spin it. We already told you why it's impossible to spin it. Like Mr. Speaker, U.S. intervention always in the past has begun because of the death of U.S. soldiers, all the way back to the USS Maine. Like, let's think about it. Like, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. FDR's speech was not December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. But guys, I think we really shouldn't provoke the Japanese, so let's pull out of the Philippines. No, it is impossible to spin U.S. Marines killed in action. That will incur a massive domestic response, especially from a right-wing hawk like Trump, who says he's going to be big and tough for the military. That is a comparative you did not deal with. Then, which side makes the NATO alliance better and stronger? We told you very clearly here the comparative. That because you have foreign troops, you're able to have more assurances for the Polish ground troops for Baltic states. We told you why, in fact, these nations become a lot more destabilized, Baltic states, when you don't have NATO troops, that they actually beg for them. That was my entire third argument. I worked really hard on it yesterday, but I was really disappointed when they did not give you a single one-line response. Guys, I worked really hard on it. I really wanted a response. The comparative, Mr. Speaker, is this. That NATO now tells Baltic states, good luck, you're going to have to rely on what Mr. Donald Trump says. So when he says NATO is obsolete, when he fails to say that he will stand by Article 5's collective defense principle, now Poland has to take their word at it. We prevent that. We've told you why Baltic states have begged NATO for more troops. We've told you why these countries are reintroducing conscription, reinitiating bills to introduce nuclear weapons. Those are all things that they have failed to engage with. The Polish people want NATO. The Estonian people want NATO. At the point at which you don't provide them troops and don't provide them the kind of benefits they ask for is the point at which they reject that alliance and become a lot more destabilized, a lot more hostile. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, I want you to clearly ask yourself, if you were the president of Estonia, would you feel safer with NATO troops in your borders or on Donald Trump's word? We think the answer is very clear. We're very proud to oppose.
Previous reply speakers have 4 minutes, 10 seconds.
And now to conclude the case for the proposition in this debate as well, I call upon Fadi.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm amused. This is the first time we've debated an opposition in which when we give them the premise on which they base their entire opposition line is first of all extremely unlikely. When we give them what they want, it has no real effect on what they want to influence while opening the world up to massive harms. But when we give them what they want and the outcome they want, and they still lose this debate, we've given them every concession, and we still win. First of all, how we want NATO to respond. We don't want NATO to go to war over land skirmishes in Latvia. We want NATO to go to war when Russia invades openly and aggressively. The Eastern Forward Presence and the tripwire response they hold so dear triggers an all-out, entirely disproportionate response. All we want is for countries to have the discretion to respond rather than an absurd response because they're bound by Article 5, right? Secondly, just to do quickly what's come out of this side, on this idea of losing the Baltic states. First of all, we'd rather do that than risk nuclear war. But second of all, if the EFP doesn't work, how does it slow down the loss of the states anyway? In fact, as we've given you from our first speaker all the way down the bench, there's massive harms to these Baltic states which push them into pro-Russian governments. That's something that they haven't dealt with on their side, right? Then on this idea of like spinning, on our side of spinning, right? And they use the example of Pearl Harbor. The whole point we were trying to get at was that they used Pearl Harbor to spin a military response because they had the political discretion to do so, right? So quickly, what's just happened in their case? First of all, why would Russia invade Poland? We gave you some reasons for that, right? First of all, who was it that initially invaded Poland, right? Germany in World War II. But secondly, they'd have to deal with things like local insurgencies, and they would piss off Western powers that would freeze bank accounts of Russian oligarchs and put sanctions on Russia. But secondly, even if we give them their power, right? Why is it that none of this works? First of all, there was this main idea from the beginning of the insurmountable geographic advantage, something that they haven't responded to clearly on their side whatsoever, right? Secondly, the fact that the number of troops doesn't actually make a difference. They tried to give us an enhanced forward presence. That's not what they should be defending on their side. They should be defending the conception of how it looks in the real world. We allowed them the concession of changing the debate and saying they can bring even more armored battalions. We gave you all kinds of practical reasons why that isn't the case, right? But there was no response to them for any of that. But thirdly, okay, we give you a full NATO response. Is this even a good thing, right? What are they looking for? They're looking for a unified response over land skirmishes in Latvia. What did Munshi tell you in his speech, right? Why is this the case? Okay, first of all, one rogue commander posturing on the front lines can cause an all-out response and an all-out war over small land skirmishes like in Latvia. Secondly, accidents happen, right? And we think it's morally perverse to put a bunch of troops with the sole intention that they die in order to trigger a full response. But secondly, the risk is so big, which is why there's only one time 2 nuclear states in modern history have gone to conventional war. This op wants to commit to a full NATO response in all situations, all the time, and in some situations, that's the worst idea in the world. But even if we stand behind that, do you really not want governments the discretion to not support nuclear war over small-time land skirmishes in places like Lithuania and in Latvia, right? So, now on to what they haven't responded to on our side. Firstly, to reinforce this, the massive geographic insurmountability, right? Secondly, on the idea of massive numbers of troops and how it isn't even an effective deterrent to begin with, right? And thirdly, I appreciate that he worked really, really hard on his third point yesterday, but so did I. And what was his response, right? His response was, he tried to make this look absurd. He tried to say, there's no logical link. When she came up and gave us that logical link, there was no analysis on their side for why that logical link is wrong, right? So, what does the EFP actually do? At the end of the day, after all said and done, all they have left standing is that they asked for this. These Baltic nations asked for this. We refuse to waste time, money, and resources to hurt nations and risk nuclear war. We beg you, for the sake of the world, to propose. Thank you very much.